Capacitors charged, all readouts in the green. We're beginning the test sequence. Firing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The great thing about working for a defense contractor was that you got given loads of money to blow stuff up. The great thing about working for a defense contractor making a prototype for the US military was that when you failed to blow stuff up, they just gave you even more money to find out why. But even the US government had limits on the amount of failure they were prepared to accept. Really broad limits. But still, I don't understand it. Everything worked this time. Why didn't the weapon fire? Dr. Brian Macclesfield had been working on the PLAC, the Plasma Lance Accelerator Cannon, for 5 years. 5 years of his life devoted to something that so far hadn't emitted so much as a single spark. Of course, it had paid off most of his mortgage and sent him to the Caribbean once a year, so it had been very successful on that score. But still, it would be nice to see it, do something. The PLAC was, in essence, a particle accelerator like the ones they used in theoretical physics labs. Except instead of accelerating a handful of atoms to near light speed and running them in a loop, it was supposed to accelerate an energized gas to slower yet still very dangerous speeds in a straight line. It was a serious engineering challenge, Sheree. You had to wire a lot of complex computers to a lot of complex electrical components to build something like that. But the basic concept behind it wasn't exactly groundbreaking. So why was getting it to work like debugging a program you wrote 20 years ago and didn't leave any documentation for? It should not be this hard. There were, at last count, at least 100 engineers and physicists working on different aspects of the PLAC, including 15 in the main team led by Brian. They'd solved the capacitor overheating problem and the coolant evaporation problem, and they'd even got the magnetic field calculations finessed, more or less. Yet still, when they turned the damn thing on, there was a really noticeable lack of explosions. Just a hum, then a shudder, and then an awkward silence, which was all the more awkward because the guys from the Pentagon were standing right behind him. He didn't even know why they bothered coming to watch the tests anymore. There hadn't been any progress in months. Actually, no, scratch that. He knew exactly why. We're, getting a little concerned about the lack of progress. Well, thank you for mentioning that, Jerry. It wouldn't have crossed my mind otherwise. I assumed you just came here for a chat about golf and to pick up a cinnamon bun from the break room, since that's all you ever fucking do around here. For a moment, Brian was tempted to say this out loud, but he stopped himself just in time. For all that Jerry Trommelbaum was essentially middle management in a colonel's uniform, he was still military. Polite dissatisfaction from the Pentagon was still a lot better than impolite dissatisfaction. Instead, he said, obviously this isn't ideal, but every new test gives us more data to work with. I know it seems like we haven't made progress, but the PLAC is no longer experiencing the kind of malfunctions that ruined prototypes in the early testing phase, and that's a really positive thing. We still have to adjust some parameters, but that's why we have extensive testing. At this point, we can firmly say that we have a working machine, except for the fact that it won't fire. Well, yes, Jerry. Except for that. I thought that would go without saying, but no, you felt you had to say it. Brian forced a smile. And the actual words that came out of his mouth were, I know that seems like a failure, but from an engineering standpoint, we're 99% of the way there. As I said, this test gives us valuable data. You can report back to Washington that while the time frame may have to be adjusted, we are still on track to deliver the PLAC program as promised. Dr. Macclesfield, we're getting a little, anxious about the whole time frame issue. The program was supposed to deliver a working prototype 2 years ago. Now, I went to bat for you with my boss, and he was able to make your case to appropriations and get a funding extension. But that grace period is rapidly running out. If you don't have a working, that is, firing prototype by the end of this fiscal quarter, then I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to defend the program any longer. But we're so close. I'm sorry, but if I don't get results I can take back to my superiors soon, it'll be out of my hands. The PLAC program is going to get its funding cut. Don't worry. I'll schedule another round of tests for next week. We'll work round the clock if we have to, but we'll get the PLAC to fire. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I want you to know that I am on your side and everyone at the Pentagon values the effort the whole team has made on this project. But, yeah. If you could just give it that little bit extra this time, really push it to 110%, that would be great. Okay? Absolutely, don't worry, we have everything here under control. Great, great. They chatted for a minute or two more, mostly about the roadworks on highway off-ramps. Then Colonel Trummelbaum said his goodbyes and awkwardly meandered out of the office, passing through the break room to pick up another cinnamon bun on his way out. After a few more seconds, the Pentagon suits who'd been staring into space seemed to realize that was their cue to leave too, and hurried out after him. Brian leaned back in his chair and breathed a sigh of relief that at least there was one problem he didn't have to deal with again today. Once Trommelbaum and his staff were out of the building, David Chan scooted over on his office chair with the squeaky wheel that never pointed the right way and leaned in to whisper, "Did I just hear to tell the Pentagon dude that we're going to have the plaque working by next week? Because we don't even know what's wrong with it yet, much less how to fix it. It has to be something to do with the magnetic field interactions in the ignition chamber. We've gone over everything else 1,000 times. The problem has to be there." Well, sure, that's the most likely scenario. But we don't actually know. And if we can't work out why it's doing what it's doing, or not doing, I mean, then it's going to be kind of hard to come up with a fix. Look, it's either this or we just give up now and start looking for new jobs. And do you know how many other high-tech jobs there are here in Maine? It's this, or designing a better cow milking machine. And I am not moving my family across the country to work at Caltech or wherever. Besides, do you want to end up back in academia? Or working in the private sector? Well, of course not, but I'm going to call a meeting with everyone. Yes, including Steve, even if I have to drag him up from the server room by his collar. It's time for emergency measures. We're going to sit down, and we're going to go over the latest test data line by line, and we're going to throw everything we have at it. And I mean everything, no matter how unlikely. The answer has to be there somewhere. We have some of the best minds in the country in this building if we just knuckle down and think we should be able to come up with something. 7 hours and 2 gallons of coffee later, and they had nothing. Finally, Brian had to admit that there was no point in keeping them there any longer. He waited another hour after everyone else had gone just so he could be sure his wife would be asleep when he got home. He really didn't want to have the argument about ignoring her texts again. He also didn't want to talk about why he'd been ignoring her texts this time. On the drive home, he was so tired he almost got himself killed. He'd forgotten the roadworks were there, and he almost went into the barriers before he yanked the steering wheel over. Fortunately, the work crew was all long gone, and the only casualty was a traffic cone, which was actually the most damage the Plexi program had done in 5 years. If you didn't count the marriages it had blown up, not every spouse was as understanding about late nights as his wife, and not everyone appreciated Maine as much either. Still, he was aware he was on pretty thin ice at this point. Just another reason he needed the project to move forward, and soon. He snuck in through the garage as quietly as he could, and to his immense relief he heard the sound of snoring from his bedroom. His wife's buzzsaw grunts a reliable indicator that she was out like a light. He used the downstairs bathroom to avoid waking her, then slipped into bed. And then, having expected to fall asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow, he just stared up at the ceiling for hours. The answer had to be there somewhere. It had to be something to do with the magnetic fields. Everything went fine with the firing sequence until the ignition chamber activated. But the math said the fields were all perfectly aligned. So what if it wasn't the fields? What if it was what the fields interacted with? The gas itself shouldn't be causing any problems. But what if the interaction between the plasma and the fields was creating exotic particles? Theoretically, the level of energy involved concentrated in that small A space was capable of creating temporary space, time bubbles that contained particles with properties that didn't have to match those of the regular universe. Of course, that was only theoretical, but it would account for a lot of the unexplained readings they'd collected. It was almost as if they were creating tiny, almost subatomic bridges to other universes that were drawing in matter that had no business being here. The bubbles were highly unstable, and as soon as they popped, the exotic particles inside would annihilate instantly, putting out energy and throwing off the field calculations. If they used some sort of feedback system which adjusted the fields as the plasma energy fluctuated, they could. Brian suddenly sat bolt upright. Then he jumped out of bed so fast he ripped the covers off and ran to his home office, ignoring his wife's shout of alarm. He slammed the door, probably waking his kids too, and turned his desktop on. Searing LED light stabbed him in the eyes, but blinking, he managed to open up his notebook and started typing feverishly. If he was right, he hadn't just solved the problem. He'd found a way to make the weapon exponentially more powerful. A week later, and the plaque was ready for another test firing, adjusted with all of Brian's new calculations. He knew the team were placing bets that it would do absolutely nothing again, with the minority betting against them, convinced that the whole thing would blow up as soon as they switched it on. Dave Chan had tried to talk him out of another test so soon. They needed more time, and like 6 more people with PhDs in theoretical physics to go over the new theory. He was in the camp that thought they were about to blow the placey to pieces, and he begged Brian to wait. But Brian pointed out that if this test failed, then it wouldn't really make much of a difference whether the plaque blew up or not. The project would be over one way or the other. Besides, after 5 years, it'd be nice to see something explode. Capacitors charged, all readouts in the green. Are all the new magnet positions reading correctly? They're in line with the new calculations. Dave said. He did not sound happy. Jerry Trommelbaum, hanging around at the back of the room with his usual posse of bored-looking bean counters, coughed to get their attention. Could we get, some kind of visual feed from the test site? What? Oh, sure, no problem, Brian said. The real excitement for his team would be in the readouts from the sensors monitoring the ignition chamber. But sure, it would be nice to actually watch the weapon fire for the first time. He flicked through the channels on the big screen until he found the feed, showing the scrubby hill they were aiming at. Jerry coughed again. I'd just like to say that if this test is successful, it will be a momentous day not just for your team but for the United States of America. This has the potential to totally change the paradigm of defending our country, and I'd like to personally thank all of you for your efforts. And we really appreciate your support, Brian said, cutting him off before he could get into full swing. Right, firing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The cameras momentarily went white as a lance of pure plasma traveling several times the speed of sound shot out across the New England countryside. They were miles away from the test site, and they still felt the ground shiver a little as the plasma hit the target dead on. It worked, Dave announced, his mouth hanging open. Of course it did, Brian said weakly. Well, on behalf of the Pentagon, I'd like to congratulate, Jerry began. Then he stopped. Excuse me, but what's that? He asked, pointing to the screen. What's what? Brian muttered, as he peered at the readings from the ignition chamber. He'd been right. Using the exotic particles to boost the power had increased energy output by an enormous amount. They'd built this thing to take out drones and airplanes, but with these power levels you could shoot out an aircraft carrier. He was already thinking about what kind of range the plaque would have and what the dissipation factor, over distance, would be. Then he glanced back at the main screen. There was something wrong with the hillside. He was expecting dust and a crater. What he was looking at was fog, and something else. It looked almost like a lens, perfectly circular, and distorting the light that went through it. But even with the distortion, he could see that what was directly behind it was not the hillside they'd been firing at. Maybe not all the exotic particles annihilated immediately. Maybe there were still enough of them in the plasma that when it came into contact with the ordinary matter on the hillside in a highly energetic collision. Oh shit. Well, isn't that the darndest thing? Jerry said. Looks almost like, some sort of gateway, or portal. Is it meant to do that? No, Jerry. No, it is not meant to do that. It took a moment for Brian to realize he'd said that out loud this time. There was a shadow moving beyond the lens of the portal. It grew bigger and bigger, and then something began to push its way through. First one titanic leg, and then another. The portal must be more than 100 feet across. The thing pushing its way through from the other side filled virtually the entire diameter. It wasn't the only thing, though. Through the fog, Brian could see smaller, faster shapes flitting and flapping out into the skies around the test site. The camera shook as the behemoth's foot came down in our world. Oh shit. Well, at least he didn't have to worry about finding a new job anymore.